Thank you for joining us for this, what's got what promised to be a very interesting talk on the topic of innovation or mimicry, early Japanese government and its relationship to China. We're very fortunate to have Professor Ethan Segal to give this talk. And I will just give a very brief introduction to Professor Segal before I pass it on to him. Oh, by the way, I'm Professor Min-Soo Kang. I'm at the History Department at UMSL here. So thank you once again for joining us for an event sponsored by the Eiichi Shibusawa Seigo Arai Endowed Professorship in Japanese Studies. The event received outstanding help from Bob L. at UMSL Global, so we very much appreciated his efforts. Thank you, Bob. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Ethan Segal, who is Associate Professor of History at Michigan State University. Professor Segal is also Chair of the Japan Council at MSU. He's a scholar of Japanese economic and monetary history, pre-modern women and gender, medieval foreign relations, and nationalism. Professor Segal earned his MA degree from the University of Washington and his Ph.D. from Stanford University. He was the recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship that allowed him to do research at the University of Tokyo. During the academic year 2008 to 2009, he was the visiting assistant professor of pre-modern Japanese history at Harvard University in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. Professor Segal is the author of Coins, Trade, and the State, Economic Growth in Early Medieval Japan, published by Harvard University Press in 2011. He has also published many articles and book chapters. In addition to his many scholarly works, Professor Segal has contributed substantial service to the discipline of Asian studies, including his current role as a member of the Executive Committee of the Midwest Conference on Asian Affairs, as our representative to the Council of Conferences of the Association of Asian Studies. So please welcome Professor Segal for his lecture, Innovation of Mimicry, Early Japanese Government and its Relationship to China. Please go ahead, Professor Segal.
Thank you very much, and thank you for an extremely generous introduction. That's very kind of you. I want to thank the University of Missouri St. Louis and Professor Laura Miller for inviting me to speak to you all today. I wish only that it could be in person, but we make do with what the circumstances dictate. And I'm delighted to spend some time with you talking about some of these really amazing changes that took place in early Japan and how they reflect Japan's relationship to China during its ancient period. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. I hope everyone is able to see the screen. Can you see the screen okay? Perfect, thank you. Okay, so my topic for today is ancient Japan. And I know we have a lot of students from Professor Miller's class here among those in the audience today. And I'm just wondering, I wish again we could do this in person, you know, what comes to mind when you hear that term, ancient Japan? And my guess is for many, at least maybe before you took Professor Miller's class, that what came to mind was something very old, very static, and very unchanging. And indeed, if we look even at the two images that were among the first that popped up on a simple Google search for ancient Japan, we see one which is this very old, very faded painting from the 8th century depicting a scene from Buddhism, or we see on the right-hand side of the screen a kofun. This is a tomb believed to be the tomb of Emperor Nintoku. These are, for those who've never heard of kofun before, probably among some of the biggest world monuments or tombs that you've never heard of. I mean, these are on the scale of the pyramids, right? Multiple football fields long for the biggest ones, including this one. But as part of what's really cool about this picture is you see this ancient tomb, which may date to the 5th century, making it about 1,500 years old, and this incredibly modern city that has built all the way around it. So while the city, of course, wasn't there 1,500 or even 500 years ago, at least not looking like that, The tomb remains somewhat unchanged, kind of reinforcing this idea that ancient Japan is somehow static or unchanging. This kind of stands in contrast to our ideas of what modern life, the life that we live in, is like. So just for someone like me, during the course of my own lifetime, I started in high school using something like this, an old electric typewriter, to type up my papers for my high school classes. And now I use something like this, in fact, an even more modern one than that, right? Which can do far, far more than this older machine could do even just a few decades ago. We live in a time when advances in science, technology, medicine, and more seem to constantly be updated and replacing each other, so that this image of, the moonwalk now already seems like an old image, right? We talked today about the possibility of traveling to Mars, for example. Or for the students, we all know that having last year's iPhone is, oh my God, absolutely unthinkable, because we're always told, at least by Apple advertising, we have to have the newest version, whether it's an iPhone or a Samsung or whatever the case might be, right? So we live in a world in which we expect change to be continuous. There's always something newer and better. And so ancient Japan must seem terribly static by contrast. That's one of the ideas I want to challenge for you in this presentation today. That actually ancient Japan, particularly the period I'm going to talk about today, underwent amazing transformations in the late 6th, 7th, and early 8th centuries, okay? Things that just kind of boggle the mind when you consider the scope and the range of the changes that were implemented during these years. Let's look quickly at just 3 examples. I'll look quickly at cities, I'll look at government, and I'll look at money. And I'll look at these briefly, but return to them later on in the course of the talk. So first, cities. So it's during this period that we really see the first cities in Japan. If we were to go back 300 or 400 years earlier to the time of Queen Himiko, for example, which again, I'm guessing Professor Miller's students are quite familiar with, there really wasn't anything like a city anywhere in the Japanese archipelago. It's really only in the course of the 7th century, really the late 7th century, that we start to see cities based on Chinese models, right? In particular, the Sui dynasty and then Tang dynasty capital city of Chang'an. This becomes the model for Japanese capital cities. And what you see here in the image is a kind of schematic outline of the city of Heijo, the city that we know today as the city of Nara. It still exists. You can still go there. And I don't think I have an easy way to ask for quick answers from those of you in the audience. So I'll just go ahead and point out some of the things I'd hope you'd notice. You'll notice that this city is very kind of orderly in the way it's laid out, right? That the streets all seem to kind of run north, south, east, west. So it's almost like a grid pattern. That the palace you see here situated to the north, so that the ruler can gaze with great benevolence and beneficence to his subjects, not always his, could be her subjects, to the south. You can't really tell from this schematic, but there are eastern and western markets that are laid out in precise locations. There are temples. You can see at least one of those marked here. But the point is, it very much commands the environment and the urban setting. And this model from China became the basis for Japanese cities during this time. You saw the construction of massive and impressive halls and gates, like this reconstruction that you see here. We saw, again, massive and impressive temples like Todaiji Temple, which I'll talk more about later in this presentation. This still exists. The gate I showed you, or the hall rather I showed you, is a reconstruction, but the temple that I'm showing you now still exists. You see, obviously, this is a photograph with modern tourists milling about in front of that giant figure, seated figure of the Buddha known as the Daibutsu. And here you see from a museum, a recreation of what they think the city of Nara looked like. This is not just some village, as you can get a sense from its scale here. This was a big and impressive place. That's part of how it was designed, not only to build on Chinese models, but to awe visitors to the city. We also saw an amazing transformation in government and in the legal system. This also drew upon Chinese precedent. Assuming most aren't able to read, especially because the image is a little bit blurry there, that upper left image, which lays out the reconstructed text of that legal code that helped to define government and the penalties that were put forth for various kinds of infractions, both civil and criminal. That's the image on the upper left. The image on the upper right with the pale green background is kind of a cartoon drawing attempting to illustrate what government became over this period. Can you see my cursor moving there on the screen? Great. So you see there the ruler, you see the head of the government ministry and of the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and then the 8 government level ministries that reported to basically the prime minister's office, okay? This also based on Chinese models. And then here in the bottom, you see a manga version of Japanese history in which this older man here is kind of explaining to everyone else how this new government is going to work, okay? And the last example I'll give you, although there are many more we could choose from, concerns money or metallic currency. Currency usually made from a bronze alloy with its primary ingredient being copper, though there were some silver coins made as well. And again, if we had the chance to talk about this in person, I'd ask you for what you find interesting about these coins. And hopefully the things you'd pick up on are, on one side of the coin, you have 4 characters, right? 4 written characters. In this case, read this way around, right? But the thing that most people pick up on is the square hole in the middle. And this was common in East Asian money, based again on Chinese precedent, because the way you group a whole bunch of coins together is run a string through those holes. So 100 coins or 1,000 coins on a string is the equivalent of like a $10 bill or a $100 bill or something like this, right? And Japanese started producing coins in the early 8th century based on this kind of Chinese model from the Tang Dynasty. And this became the pattern for Japanese money for the next 250 years. So the image you see now on the bottom are other subsequent kinds of coins the Japanese produced all the way up until the year 958. So 708 from 958, 250 years of money based on this pattern. As all of these and other transformations indicate, there was a lot going on in this period. It was not the static image we might associate with ancient Japan. That by the 8th century, we had an urban capital in which perhaps as many as 200,000 people, representing perhaps as much as 5% of the population of the Japanese archipelago, were living. That we had people, at least those in the cities, using money and using markets, and much, much more, which I'll explain on my next slide. But the reason I'm pausing for a second before I jump to it is to return to the big picture point. And the big picture point is the result of all these changes is that central government is much stronger than it was before. Right at the beginning of this period versus the end of this period, we have much, much stronger central government, stronger than anything we've seen in the Japanese islands up to this point in time. Now let's look at what those other examples of change are. They're all part of a process commonly referred to as the Taika reforms. You see that term there highlighted in yellow. Taika could be translated as great change, okay? So what kinds of things are we talking about? New legal codes, new government ministries, I've already alluded to those. We see the ruler now claiming that all of the land in the country belongs to the ruler, okay? And that ruler then distributes the land to the people who hold it temporarily for their use at the pleasure of the ruler. We also see the ruler dividing up the land, creating provinces, counties, and townships. I think I translate them elsewhere as districts. The point is you have big units and then smaller units within those, and even smaller units within those. So ways for government to control the land and the people who live on it. We see families required to register and to respond to a census carried out every 6 years. Many of us this year responded to the census, which ends, I think, very soon. I hope you have responded. Do so if you haven't yet. But we see a similar process going on in ancient Japan. And on the basis of that census, the land is redistributed. So if your family gains people, you get more land. Sadly, that means if your family loses people, you lose some of your land. So it was supposed to be equitable in the sense that more land for a bigger family. We also saw military conscription. Each village had to produce a certain number of young men who served in the army for a certain number of years, depending on the population of the village. Okay. We saw the creation of these Chinese-style capital cities that I've already shown you. And it's during this period, you notice up to now I've referred to the head of state as the ruler, which is kind of a vague term. It's only from this period, from the end of the 7th century, that we start to see Japanese rulers using the term that we usually translate as emperor. And this also was based on a kind of attempt to create an equivalent term to the Chinese ruler's title. In China, we translate that as emperor, so we often translate the term from Japanese as emperor as well, though not everybody believes that's an appropriate translation. So with that as background, I want to try to explore 3 key questions for the remainder of my time together with you. First, how did Japan develop such a strong central government so quickly? Now, I know, 150 years or so, it might not sound like it's quickly, but it's actually pretty quickly to push through such massive change in a society where you don't have some of the modern conveniences that we do today, like telephones or the internet or anything like this, right? So for a pre-modern society to go through such a rapid transformation that led to so much gaining central government power is pretty remarkable. And as you might imagine, there are people who resisted, right? If you're a local elite off in the countryside, why would you want to give power to the central government? So how did the Japanese leadership accomplish this? Secondly, what role did China play? Now, if you listened to all those examples I've given you so far, I think almost every one that I mentioned, I talked about there being a Chinese precedent for it, right? That it was based on a Chinese model. So did the Japanese merely copy what they learned or saw going on in China? Or did they take Chinese models and innovate with them to create something that was inspired by China, but uniquely Japanese at the same time? And then lastly, and very briefly, I want to talk about how these changes affected the lives of ordinary people. Because when you study ancient history the way that I do and Professor Miller does, much of our attention, unfortunately, ends up focusing on elites, the people at the top. And the reason is they're the ones who left the written records. Most people were illiterate in a pre-modern society. Often their archaeological remains are more voluminous as well. But I want to try to talk a little bit about how some of these changes must have affected the lives of ordinary people living in Japan at that time. Okay, if we're all good, I'm going to keep going here. I can't see anybody's faces, so I hope we are. So how did the Japanese develop strong central government so quickly? So I'm going to give you 4 answers, and I'll talk about them then in a little bit of detail. First, they had to eliminate rivals to the, I probably shouldn't use that word imperial, let's say the royal family maybe instead, because they haven't started using the term emperor yet. But there were other contending powerful families, so they had to eliminate those rivals. Second, and this might seem paradoxical, they had to lose an overseas war. And I say paradoxical because usually losing a war doesn't work to your benefit. But in this case, I'm going to argue that it did. Third, they had to win a domestic war, a civil war among competing branches of the royal family. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, they built close ties with organized religion. And that religion was, of course, Buddhism. So let's talk about each of these in turn. So let's set the stage. In the second half of the 6th century, rather. So this is right before this period of change that I'm talking about. What's going on? So the central government is nominally led by a ruler who uses the title Okimi. And that's a title we might translate as Great King, okay? But I said nominally led because in fact, the most powerful family at the royal court is a family called the Soga. We might call them an aristocratic family. They are not the royal family themselves. They probably are descended from Korean immigrants to Japan. And they are kind of the power behind the throne. Powerful enough that by, say, the 580s, they are almost able to handpick which member of the royal family will sit on the throne. And in one particularly infamous case, when that person they choose proves to be uncooperative, they probably arranged for his assassination so they could replace him with someone else. So Soga members are clearly the dominant family at court. Meanwhile, in the provinces, we have a number of leading provincial families that are dominant in their region of the country, and they're still pretty autonomous from the central government. And the last thing I'll mention about this period is that Buddhism is a very new and contested religion in the second half of the 6th century. Let's look at what I mean by that. So Buddhism is introduced to Japan from Korea. Korea at this time is divided into 3 kingdoms. You can see them here, Goguryeo in the north, Baekje, sometimes written with a P, but Baekje in the kind of southwest, and Shilla in the southeast. There's also a small territory called Kaya or Gaya, although by the second half of the 6th century, it's actually gone. So this map's not quite the most accurate for our exact year. And it's the ruler of one of these kingdoms, the southwestern kingdom of Baekje, who either in the year, most sources say 552, the year is disputed depending on which source you read, sends a letter to the ruler of Japan. And this is a translation of that letter. I'm not going to take the time to read the whole thing, but if you kind of skim it very quickly while I'm talking about it here, what you'll notice is that he basically says, this is the most amazing doctrine in the world. You know, I say to my students sometimes, it's almost like if you believe in it and practice it, all your wishes will come true, right? That is kind of what he says here, right? Imagine a man in possession of his treasures to his heart's content, right? So that he might satisfy all his wishes in proportion as he used them. So he's really kind of promising the moon here. And along with this letter, he sends a Buddhist statue and he sends some texts. And the Japanese court isn't quite sure what to do with all this. The leadership is divided. The Soga family, which probably was already practicing Buddhism, because remember, they came almost certainly from Korea, said, no, we should try out this new religion. We should adopt it. But other families were opposed to it because they said Japan already has something like religion, and they were talking about the native deities that today we would call Shinto. I'll talk more about that in a second. There's a lot more detail to this conflict, but to jump to the chase, by the year 587, this actually leads to a small conflict. We might even call it a war fought between pro-Buddhist forces led by the Soga and anti-Buddhist or conservative forces led by the Mononobe and the Nakatomi. Now, the Mononobe was a military clan. The Nakatomi were, we might call them Shinto ritualists, perhaps. And the Soga side wins. And as a result, Buddhism comes to be accepted by basically everyone in the Japanese court. But although that is the case, it's still very much a religion of the elites. We have no evidence anyway that the common people have much awareness of it or are practicing it yet. That starts to change a little bit as we see more and more key figures in government take more interest in the religion. One important example of that is the figure often referred to in English as Prince Shotoku. In Japanese, he's known as Shotoku Taishi. You see an image of him there on the old 10,000 yen currency bill. He's not on there anymore. Or this image of him here on the right, where he's not standing with 2 children and he wasn't tall enough to start on Japan's basketball team. They've merely drawn him as very tall to kind of show how dignified and holy he was. The same way you might see in Western art, the image literally of a halo or a shining light around a figure, right? And Shotoku Taishi served, depending on the sources you read, as a kind of regent to the female emperor of the time. Some of us dispute whether he really was regent or not, but he certainly had a key role in government. So what are some of the things that he accomplished during this time? Well, he was a major supporter of Buddhism. He creates a new cap and rank system to kind of organize the government officials and put them in proper places. He creates a 17-article set of guidelines. It's sometimes called Shotoku's 17-article constitution. I think that's a terrible name. It's not a constitution the way, say, the United States has a constitution. It's more like a set of moral guidelines to government and proper behavior. You can find it readily available in English translation if you're curious to look at it. He, of course, holds high government office and plays a role in making some of the most important decisions of the day. And he founds major temples. And this, I joke to my own students, it's kind of like if you travel around New England in the United States, almost any old inn that you stay in will say George Washington slept here or something, right? Well, old temples in this part of Japan, so many of them say, oh, we were founded by Prince Shotoku. So many that frankly, I don't think it's true. But some of them he certainly did found. And probably the most famous is this one, Horuji Temple, which still exists, located outside of Nara. Gorgeous, gorgeous temple. If you get to Japan and you're in the Nara region, I highly recommend you visit, though sadly it was badly damaged by a fire a few years ago. So I'm not sure how many of the buildings are standing or what state the state of repairs are. But we know right away, looking at this image, again, for the students in the audience, that this is a Buddhist temple, not only from the architectural style, but also from this building you see here, this kind of multi-storied tower that in English we often call a pagoda. And when you see a pagoda, if you're trying to decide if this is a Shinto site or a Buddhist site in Japan, because you'll find both often right next to each other, the presence of a pagoda generally marks it as a Buddhist site. And the reason is, at least in theory, at the base of every pagoda, you'll have a Buddhist relic, right? Some fragmentary piece, in theory, of the historic Buddha himself, similar to the idea of relics in Western Europe or in Europe during the medieval age of Christendom, right? The other thing I like about pagodas, at least this, I'm showing you the schematic here, is that they're generally built with one principal supporting pole here in the center, which is great for an earthquake-prone country like Japan, because when an earthquake hits, I don't know if you can see my arm here, the whole thing will, shake like this, but it won't collapse the way it might if there were two poles that moved in different directions, right? So a lot of these pagodas actually are, 1,000 years or more old. So that's pretty cool. By contrast, if you're looking at a Shinto site, if it's a significant sized shrine, there's a good chance it'll have a gate like this called a torii gate, right? Kind of two posts with two beams across the top, often, though not always, in this kind of bright vermilion color. Shinto, of course, is thought of as Japan's native religion, though it wasn't really organized as an organized religion until much, much later. And it originated not only with the worship of kind of native deities, but also with the worship of natural phenomenon. So you see the veneration of this very great ancient tree, or you might find small Shinto shrines or sites of worship at various natural phenomena like a waterfall or a mountain or something like this. Now, although I mentioned these two religions and their supporters were in conflict in the 6th century, for most of Japanese history, Buddhism and Shinto have gotten along pretty well. So as I mentioned today, it's very common to see a Buddhist temple and a Shinto shrine as neighbors or even sharing the same grounds. And many modern Japanese practice to some degree both religions. So it's kind of, if you ask many Japanese what religion you are, you might find them a little confused by the question. Many, for example, might have a Shinto wedding, but a Buddhist funeral, and no one would think that very strange. The way in the West, by contrast, we often assume someone has to be one major religion, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or whatever, right? But back to our story. So how does the government assert power so effectively? Well, part one of my answer, of course, was eliminate rivals. And the first thing they had to do was eliminate the Soga family. Now you see on the left there a rather complicated genealogical chart written in Japanese. I don't expect you to follow it. You'll have to take my word for it, except for those of you who can read Japanese, that we see many people who are with the surname Soga listed here, and that they're married into the imperial family. All the people with little numbers by their names, 29, 33, 31, 32, these were members of the royal family. And as you see there, here's a Soga right here. They're very closely intermarried with the Soga. In 645, however, a crown prince who is not related to the Soga by blood plots an assassination. We have no images. This image you see here is from an artist drawing this much, much later. So it's really just his imagination of what the scene might look like. But you kind of see here the sword-wielding crown prince. Here you see the decapitated body of the leader of the Soga family with blood spurting out of its head, and other people looking on kind of in shock. And here the female emperor actually fleeing the scene, okay? Whether it really played out like this, we don't know, but it does appear to be the case that they assassinated the head of the Soga. And this kind of secured power in the royal family moving forward for at least the next 100+ years. Part two, how do you develop a strong central government? lose a foreign war. So let's turn for a quick second then to Japan's neighbors. In the early 7th century, China was just being reunified after many, many years of division. The Han Dynasty collapsed in the early 3rd century, and it wasn't until the late 6th century that the Sui Dynasty started to reunify China. It was short-lived and then replaced by the much longer-lasting Tang Dynasty. But you see here in yellow the territory of the Sui. You also see here Korea. Now this shows, those orange lines are modern political demarcations. The truth is, this is Korea's three kingdoms period, as I already mentioned. Goguryeo in the north, Baekje in the southwest, Shilla in the southeast. Japan is very close with Baekje. Sui Dynasty China sees Goguryeo up in north. This right here would be Sui Dynasty China. This would be Korean Goguryeo Korea. They actually fight several wars, and despite the power of the Sui Dynasty, they are unable to defeat Goguryeo. And when Tang replaces Sui as the new empire in China, they face the same problem. So the Tang Chinese ally themselves with Shilla. And their thought is the Tang can attack from the north. Whoops, let me go back one. Shilla can attack from the south, and together they will gang up on Goguryeo. The problem is, I know this is getting a little complicated here, in order for Shilla to have the best access to Goguryeo, it needs to take out Baekje. And of course, when Baekje gets attacked, it turns to its ally, Japan, which you can see just barely here in the far corner. So now I'll go to that next slide here. So we have, during these unification wars, we have Tang and Shilla. Tang is China, Shilla is kind of southeastern Korea, fighting a war against Baekje, southwestern Korea, and Japan. And the Japanese side loses badly. In particular, the Japanese Navy fights a naval battle at this place, the Baekjeon River, against a combined Shilla and Tang fleet, and they are utterly destroyed. They limp back, the few ships that remain, to Japan. But here's where the Japanese leaders take advantage of this defeat. They say to their compatriots back in Japan, we're really nervous. China is going to get revenge against us for this. They know we fought on the other side. So we have to centralize power and use this foreign threat to reform ourselves so we're ready to fight off a Chinese invasion. We have a very similar example to this in our own history in the United States. Think about 9/11, right? 9/11, a terrible, terrible domestic act of terrorism here in the United States that cost thousands of lives, and that allowed the Bush administration in the aftermath to push through certain government reforms like the so-called Patriot Act that many in Congress say they would have resisted had it not been for the event of 9/11, right? So kind of a similar situation. What happened is Japan began to militarize. It began building fortifications all along the southwest seaboard. It grabbed power and grabbed land from regional elites that it said it needed for Japan's defense. It created this conscript army, so it had soldiers to fight off an anticipated Chinese invasion. That invasion never actually happened, but it was a serious threat, and it certainly helped Japanese leaders solidify central power. The result is by the 8th century, the map looks like this. We now have Tang China, Shilla dominating the Korean peninsula, and a much more unified Japan controlling at least most of the three southernmost main Japanese islands. Hokkaido is not yet part of Japan. Even this region's kind of only a little bit magenta, and that's good, that's accurate. Okay, part 3, win a domestic war. So that war I just told you about, the war in Korea, was the 660s. By the early 670s, we saw a civil war being fought now by members of the royal family, in particular between two contenders for the throne, one who was the younger brother of the ruler who just died, and one who was the son of the ruler who just died. So it's basically uncle against nephew. And the long and the short of it is the uncle wins, the younger brother of the former ruler wins. This is called the Jinshin Civil War. And again, I'm skipping a lot of details here. The point is, what better way to be able to push through reforms in government than to have an army at your back and to have just won a civil war? This gives you a certain power to push through changes that otherwise would not have happened. So that uncle goes on to take the title, the name Temmu as he rules. And he dies about 10 years, a little more than 10 years later. He is succeeded by his widow, who rules as Emperor Jito. And actually, we think it's she who first used that term, Tenno, that we translate as emperor. Because they had won a war, they were able to push through changes that their predecessors could not. So a lot of the key changes I talked about in the Taika reform slide that I showed you earlier, like modifying the rank system of officials, adding government ministries, fixing the provincial boundaries, and building the first Chinese style capital, all happened under Temmu and Jito. And the image you see here at the bottom, this is the mausoleum where they are both supposedly interred. And here you see from a comic book version of their history. And here we see Emperor Temmu. I call her Emperor Temmu, even though emperor sometimes we think of as male, because she's not an empress. She's not like a first lady. She is really ruling in her own right? And as this comic book says, here we see her proclaiming the construction of Fujiwara-kyo, Japan's first planned city. So when you see all of these things that I talked about as part of the Taika reforms, all of these things happen over this period of 150 years or so, and many of them really in the last 60 years after these steps have happened. But there's one last step I want to talk about before wrapping up this question of how you gain so much central power. And that is the role of religion. So I began by talking about religion, and we talked about how Buddhism gained the support of elites, but it's really in the 8th century that we see the state, the government, develop a strong symbiotic relationship with Buddhism that helps it spread throughout the country. And in particular, if we were going to pick one ruler to talk about, it would be Emperor Shomu, who ruled, you see, from years 724 to 749. Now, this guy had a lot of challenges to wrestle with during his reign. For one of them, there was a major smallpox epidemic in Japan in the late 730s that some scholars estimate may have killed 25% or more of the population. So really, really devastated, far, far more virulent than the pandemic we are wrestling with right now. He also faced several rebellions by competing contenders for the throne. He was obviously able to suppress those, but a lot of uncertainty and a lot of questioning of his legitimacy to rule. So he turned to religion, in part to help legitimize himself and his government. He became a devout Buddhist. Now, I'm not saying he wasn't genuine in his religious belief, but we have to assume also that he recognized the value of Buddhism as a way to bolster his position and the strength or legitimacy of his government. And it's he who orders the construction of that incredibly impressive temple I showed you earlier, the temple Todaiji. And it becomes the head of a network of temples. He orders every province of the country to have a temple, a monastery, and a nunnery built so that Buddhist prayers and Buddhist teachings can be spread throughout the country. And by doing so, he hopes to accumulate Buddhist merit that will serve to benefit him and his administration. The point of all this is, of course, Buddhism gains from its relationship to the state because all these temples, monasteries, and nunneries are being built, and the state benefits because Buddhism is helping to reinforce support for the state among the people. So here you see a photograph of Todaiji Temple today. Lots of tourists standing there, walking to and from the temple. Here you see the giant Buddha figure inside. I'm trying to remember now exactly how tall. I want to say around 14 meters or so, which must put him at a little between 45 to 50 feet. Very, very big, very, very kind of awe-inspiring. The temple complex also includes its own treasure house. And when this treasure house was opened in the late 19th century, they found all kinds of amazing stuff from, say, the 8th century, more than 1,000 years old, evidence that Japan, at least through indirect trade, was part of the Silk Road that you've probably heard of that linked many, many states and societies across Asia and even as far away as the Mediterranean. So how did Japanese develop a strong central government so quickly? I hope what I've been talking about has illustrated these 4 points, right? Eliminating rivals to the imperial family, losing an overseas war, winning a domestic war, and building close ties with organized religion. That leaves us two other key questions, and these will be much more brief because I want to leave lots of time for questions and discussion. The second of the three questions was, what roles did China play? Did the Japanese imitate or did they innovate? Now, this is a topic that has been debated by scholars, modern scholars, for quite some time. Here you see two proponents of two very different views. In the top quote in blue from a very important British historian of Japan who was active in kind of the middle of the 20th century, Sir George Sansom, who writes, these Taika reforms were a bold attempt to apply the systems of land tenure, provincial and local government, and taxation, which were then in operation in China. The central government, he notes, however, was not strong enough to impose its new rules, and the degree of compliance varied from place to place. So basically, he's saying they were copying from China, and in fact, they were not very successful. The central government didn't have enough power to really make it happen. By contrast, we look at the work of a more recent scholar, Joan Pigott at the University of Southern California, who in her book, The Emergence of Japanese Kingship, writes, a common assumption has been that the polity outlined by the Ritsuryo codes replicated the Chinese model. That view, however, she writes, needs revision. And she rejects Sansom's view that the codes failed to penetrate and influence the countryside in any way, citing a wide range of documentation on wood, paper, and archaeological sources that demonstrate how local elites from east to west competed for official appointments, obeyed commands to construct provincial and district headquarters, and much, much more. So she's saying, yes, there may have been a Chinese model, but that the Japanese innovated to make it fit their own circumstances, and that they did have the power to implement it even in the countryside from east to west. So what kinds of evidence are we talking about? Well, we should, of course, be aware that even prior to the period I'm talking about, the way this stuff is written down, the way the Japanese learn about stuff is by reading and writing in Chinese. So what you're seeing here, although it's the Kojiki, which is a Japanese source, the characters are originally Chinese characters, right? And beneath that, you see examples of mokkan, wooden slips. Remember that previous quote talked about sources on wood? These are the kinds of sources we're talking about before they had paper or other kinds of writing materials in Japan, right? Written records recorded on slips of wood or bamboo, okay? And when the Japanese learn about Buddhism, it's Koreans who introduce it to the Japanese, but it's in Chinese translation, right? Buddhism, as you know, I hope, originated in India, written down in Sanskrit or some other language from the South Asian subcontinent, right? But it's translated into Chinese when it comes to China, and it's in Chinese that the Japanese learn about it. So of course, China influences Japan's knowledge of the rest of the world. Urban design, as I already talked about, there's no question that Japanese cities were modeled after Chinese cities. So I know the quality of the image there on the left's not so good, but hopefully you can see here we have the palace in the north. Here we see the north, south, east, west layout of the streets. Here we see the west market and the east market. And you see the same thing here for Nara, palace in the north, the western and the eastern markets, temples laid out at key points throughout the city. So clearly there was influence, but there also were some differences. Chang'an, for example, was a walled city. It had a massive wall all the way around it. Nara, by contrast, was not. Nor was the city of Heian, which we know today as Kyoto, its successor city, which was Japan's capital for over 1,000 years. Money, I talked about this example further. This is actually a photograph that I took when I was in the Chinese city of Xi'an. It's on the sidewalk, and it's basically a giant replica of the Tang Dynasty coin called the Kaiwen Dongbao. Here you see that coin on the left, and here you see the Japanese coin, the Wado Kaichin, on the right. And again, I know the image quality isn't so great, but hopefully you can recognize they look pretty similar, right? They're round, they have a square hole in the middle, they have 4 characters. You can't tell from the image, but the metal content is even quite similar, basically a bronze alloy with copper as the primary ingredient. And even the style of the calligraphy, if you look at this character here, Kai, right? And inside it, you see this almost kind of tic-tac-toe-like little element. And you see the Japanese version Kai here, same kind of calligraphy style drawn here. So clearly the Japanese were modeling their money after a Chinese example. And there you see the two coins, Tang Dynasty and Japanese. That being said, there's lots of innovation going on in this period too. And of the many examples I could pick from, my favorite really are these: the Kojiki, the Nihongi, and the Manyoshu. The Kojiki and the Nihongi are the earliest Japanese written histories of their own people. And although the Chinese also had written histories of Chinese dynasties, these are radically different in tone, in style, and in the kinds of things that they record. My favorite of these works, though, is the one in the bottom right. I know the cover maybe isn't so easy to read. You see it called 10,000 Leaves, Love Poems from the Manyoshu. So that one, I guess, only has love poems. But the Manyoshu is the first Japanese imperial poetry collection. And let me tell you, folks, some of the poems included in there, if you read them in English, I really think you will find them moving and touching. Poems not only about love, which of course there are, but poems about death and loss, poems about suffering, someone is suffering who's living in poverty, poems about the passage of time, really kind of deep topics that we can relate to even some 1,200 years later. And I love teaching these poems and talking about them with my own students. So was there some copying? Was there some imitation? Sure. But there was a lot of innovation, I think, going on as well. And the last question, very quickly, how did all of these changes affect the lives of ordinary people? Well, the quick answer is a whole heck of a lot, right? We now see those provincial families that had been pretty autonomous at the start of this period squarely under the control of the central government. And for not even elite people, just for ordinary people, they are now living in a very different conception of space, right? Because they now identify as living in a particular province and in a district within that province. And they are supervised by government officials appointed from the capital, not from necessarily their local region. And everyone in their family has to be recorded as part of the government census. And how accurate it is recorded reflects how much land they will be given every 6 years. And lastly, of course, if you're a family in which there's a young man, there's a good chance that young man, you may lose him to the army for a number of years, which is really hard for an agricultural family, because a young man of, say, college age might be one of the kind of good, hardworking people you have in your family to help you tend the fields or raise the animals or whatever the case might be. So clearly, this has profound effects on the daily lives of ordinary people as a result of all of these changes. That's the end of my presentation. I know it's been a little bit quick, but I hope it made sense, and I hope it gave you a sense of what's going on in this period and why I think these changes are so amazing. Thank you so much for your attention. I'd love to take some questions.
Okay, great. Can you hear me, Dr. Segal?
Yes.
Okay, good. So for those of you listening, please send in questions via the Q&A button at the bottom there. And as they come in, I will read them out so that Professor Segal can answer them. And so as we're waiting, I guess I will go first, taking my privilege as the moderator. My little familiarity with this topic is all on the Korean angle. And some of the new research that's been coming out on this is that, again, in the case of Korea itself, it is not mere imitation, but innovation as well. That the Korean philosophers, religious leaders, and other intellectuals were getting the Chinese stuff and putting their particular Korean take on it. And of course, a lot of what Japan's receiving is not straight from China, but out of envoys sent from Baekje and predominantly in Baekje, but also a massive amount of migrants who are coming to Japan after the collapse of those two kingdoms. And so I was wondering if you could talk about the fact that not only is it being innovated in Japan, but it's already innovated versions of Chinese culture from Korea. So what they're innovating is actually, in many cases, particular Korean interpretations and innovations of the original Chinese.
Well, that's a great comment. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you 100%. The Japanese knowledge of this, Chinese advanced civilization comes through two ways, really. Part of it is direct contact with China. And I know the students in Professor Miller's class, I think, are going to be reading maybe next week work by Douglas Fuqua, who's a good scholar of this period, who talks about Japanese missions to the Sui and to the Tang. So some of it is direct without Korean mediation, but some of it is very much, as you mentioned, through Korean hands or through Korean pens, maybe I should say, or brushes, right? Not only examples like the one I gave of the king of Baekje sending Buddhist texts to Japan, but also by immigrants, as you mentioned, right? A result of these wars that we talked about in the 660s, where two different Korean kingdoms are dissolved. And you do have some people who flee the remains of that war to Japan. Some of them actually, you might recall, those of you listening, I talked about the Japanese building up fortifications to fight off an expected Chinese invasion. Well, guess who the leaders of that effort are? They're Korean refugees in Japan. And they are building what the Japanese themselves call Korean-style fortifications, right, to try to fight off the Chinese. So there is no doubt that Korea plays a key role in the mediation of this knowledge as it enters Japan from the continent. And that relationship will continue, although once Korea is unified under Silla, Japan and Silla kind of have a contentious relationship. So there are times when their relations aren't so good there, but it'll kind of wax and wane over the next few centuries. But excellent point. Thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to see that there are quite a few questions. Okay, let's see. Okay, the first one, anonymous attendee. How much was money used in the economy of the time?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that scholars of monetary history debate, and this is definitely an area in my wheelhouse, so to speak. So not a huge amount. I mean, if we're talking about the archipelago, all of the Japanese islands as a whole, probably not used all that much. Although there have been examples of that Wado Kaichin coin, the one that I showed the picture of, found in most of the modern prefectures of Japan. Now, whether that means they were brought there in the 8th century or whether some of those coins could have been brought to those regions at a later date is hard to determine, right? But we're not talking about coins that were just buried there 50 years ago. They were buried there a long time ago. So to some degree, these coins must have circulated throughout the Japanese islands. The reality based on the written sources, however, suggests the use of this money was pretty problematic. Part of why, I could try to go back to that slide maybe, but I don't want to take too much time up. You remember I showed you a slide with a whole bunch of other coins the Japanese produced over 250 years. Part of why they started making those other coins is the older coins started losing value through a combination of inflation and less copper available to use in minting coins. So what the rulers did, it wasn't really very, I mean, if any of you are taking economics 101, your economics professor will probably tell you this is not a good policy, but the Japanese did it anyway. They tried to mint new money and said, okay, the new coins are going to be worth 10 of the old coin. But the people didn't buy it. They're like, this coin's no better than the other coin. Why should I assume it's worth 10 of the old one? It'd be like saying if I had pennies in my pocket and we don't place much value in pennies, the government will start minting a new penny, which has a different picture on it and saying, okay, this is now like a dime. Are you going to accept it? Probably not, right? Why would you? So the result was inflation became quite bad. There also was a problem of counterfeiting. And we see examples in the law codes of severe punishments for counterfeiters, but they're issued multiple times, suggesting the government was either unable or unwilling to enforce it. And so that's kind of why the use of coins dies out by the 10th century. So we do know they were used by some people, particularly in the capital region, less so by people in the countryside, and that the use of money was, not as smooth as the government would have liked.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Sure.
The second question is, how powerful were continental Chinese / Korean immigrant families? And this is Richard Chung asking, and Richard Chung says, I was specifically thinking of the Soga and Hatta families in court politics during this period. Were they considered fair players, or was there evidence that ethnicity was discriminated against?
Boy, that's a great question. The last part's a really great question. And I can already think of a couple people who I'd love to have answered for you. I'm not sure I'm the right one to do that. The first part of the question is a little bit easier. There is no question that families that were of immigrant descent, right, Chinese or Korean, did rise to prominent positions in the ancient court or ancient aristocracy of Japan. Presumably, one reason for that was their advanced knowledge of things like Buddhism or writing or record keeping or architecture or medicine or something like this, right? That gave them an advantage over some native or domestic families that weren't as familiar with those things yet. I'm talking now like, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. I think there always was an awareness in some cases of these, the fact that they originally came from the continent. I don't know how much discrimination there was against them. I mean, the first person I want to ask this to is Nadia Kanazawa, who is working on this topic. So we'll have to save the answer for that, maybe for her book to come out, which I hope will be soon.
Okay, excellent. All right, so another anonymous question is, how do you see themes of mimicry versus innovation playing out in later historical eras and currently? If I may add something, do you remember like during the 80s when there was a great deal of concern in America about Japanese industrial products? I mean, one of the common accusations was that they never invent anything. They just, they don't invent the car, but they make cheaper versions of it and so on and so on.
Yeah. So yeah, I'd love to talk about that period. I mean, that's a period that, you and I anyway lived through, right? And indeed, so for those of you who are college students listening in, this may seem mind-boggling because I think today, in the minds of young people, we think of Japan as a great innovator, a sort of source of technological wonder, right? I mean, if you have a PlayStation or a Nintendo, if you know any of the many great electronic products that Sony made over the years, or we think of Japan still, I think, as producer of some remarkable, innovative automobiles and other kinds of electronic goods. And of course, in the creative realm as well, right? From animated film, manga, graphic novels, all kinds of things. We think of Japan as a great source of cultural innovation. But if you were to go back even a few decades to the period when Professor Kong and I were a little bit younger, or maybe when your parents, or whatever, were our age, there were charges that the Japanese were copiers and didn't create anything, merely copied, right? Maybe the most famous example was the transistor radio. The transistor was, of course, developed by Bell Laboratories, but they didn't actually see a great use for it. And so they sold the patent to what eventually became Sony, which made the little transistor radio you could carry around, and then went on to innovate the Walkman, right? Which used to be a little portable cassette player, a little portable CD player, and all this kind of thing. So definitely there were those charges levied against Japan, but it doesn't seem to have stuck very much, does it? Right? Because I don't think people of my daughter's age would think of Japan that way at all. And I think even if we look at the things going on in the 1980s, it was never just copying, right? I mean, the Japanese obviously saw uses for this technology that Americans didn't. To use the car example that Professor Kong mentioned, Americans were in love with their big gas guzzling cars. And then the oil crisis of the 1972, 1973 happened. And suddenly Americans weren't in love with those cars anymore. Well, the Japanese had not been producing those kinds of cars because Japan is a much smaller, more densely populated country. You don't have room for a big Buick or Cadillac or something. So they already were making smaller, more fuel efficient cars. Japan also is not endowed with its own natural sources of oil. So all of the gasoline, almost all the gasoline is imported and therefore more expensive. So they needed to innovate to produce cars that were smaller, for more densely packed streets, and that were more fuel efficient. And suddenly Americans in the 70s, as gas prices began to shoot up, discovered, hey, maybe these Japanese cars aren't such a bad idea after all. In terms of other periods of copying, the other one that immediately comes to mind is the late 19th century Meiji period for Japan, where Japan was kind of newly open to the encounter with the West and imported many Western examples of different kinds of things. So this is like 1870s, 1880s, when Japan, I hate to use the term seclusion because that's not really accurate, but certainly had strictly limited foreign relations before this. But in the 1870s and 1880s, they based their new education system on the American system. They based their new constitution on the Constitution of Prussia, which we later think of as Germany. They based their legal system on the French legal system. So they were very much importing foreign systems of government, law, and education. And so many people saw the Japanese as copiers and imitators. But I think there too, very quickly, they began to adapt and adopt these things to fit Japanese circumstances.
Great, thank you. Let's see. All right, so Lina Ni asks, Professor Segal, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. May I ask about the international war in the 7th century? We know there were multiple competing regimes in Korea, Goguryeo, Silla, Baekje, etc. And I wonder, what about Japan? In addition to the Yamato court, do you know any other competing regimes that Yamato was competing against? And why did Yamato win the victory eventually?
Great question. So if we go back a little bit earlier in time, definitely Japan is not unified the way that it is by, say, the 7th century. Well, I can easily give you 3 examples. One would be kind of the southern half of Kyushu Island, which is the southernmost of the 4 major islands of Japan. And there are many stories in those early histories, the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, about Japanese military forces that had to travel there to kind of subdue the so-called barbarian peoples of Kyushu. And there was even a major rebellion in the early 6th century, if I recall correctly, called Iwai's Rebellion, where the local ruler there basically refused to allow the central Japan ruler to continue interacting with the Korean Peninsula. And that eventually was crushed. So that goes into the early 6th century. Another example, a little bit earlier in time, is the region on the Sea of Japan coast, kind of southwest Sea of Japan coast, called the Izumo region. I'm sorry, I don't have a map I can show you right away. But this region clearly was originally kind of its own independent polity. Those Kofun tombs that I showed you earlier, the giant tombs that had kind of the round head and then the kind of triangular base, those kinds of tombs exist in Izumo as well, but they're shaped very differently, suggesting different influences. And the deity who's most closely associated with that region, who's today we know as Susanoo, often referred to as the god of storms, probably, we think, used to be considered an independent and equal deity of the Japanese sun goddess Amaterasu. But when that region was conquered, they kind of incorporated the storm god, the local god, into their pantheon and made him kind of the unruly younger brother of the sun goddess, right? So it's a way to kind of subdue the god as well, okay? And then the final region would be what's often called Eastern Japan, what today we think of as the Kanto region where Tokyo is, and which again was somewhat autonomous into this period and had to be kind of conquered by forces sent out from the central part of the country in the Yamato region. But by the time we get to the 7th century, most of those areas are reasonably under control. And the next major area for conquest will be the northern part of Honshu, the biggest of the 4 islands. So I can very quickly try to go back to that map I showed you with the magenta. I think I can find it quickly because it's kind of cool. It's why I like that map. Trying to find it for you really quickly here. There we go. Okay, I'll share screen again very quickly. So by the time we get to this period, if I were redrawing this map myself, I found this somewhere, I would do it even better. Make this region, you see how it's kind of fading out from magenta into white? Really that fade should start more like around the end of Japan. Okay, this region is still pretty independent of central Japanese government authority. And the Yamato region, which is this region where the rulers are sending armies up here to try to conquer this. Tagajo is their main fort. And there's a wonderful article about this by a scholar named Carl Friday called Pushing Beyond the Pale, where he talks about the conquest of this region that's going on roughly at the same time that I've been talking about today.
Great. Let's see. Right. Mike Nolan asks, I remember reading once that every Japanese emperor had been a man, and that was incorporated in Japanese law. So I was surprised to learn that Emperor Jito was a woman.
Thank you so much for bringing this up because I love talking about this. I don't know where you read it, Mike, but it's wrong. Okay. You may have read it in a Japanese newspaper article because I've seen people interviewed about this and they get it wrong. You may have seen it from a modern Japanese right-wing group that believes only men should be allowed to sit on the throne, but it's absolutely false. There definitely were female emperors and more than one. In this crucial period I've been talking about, actually, if you count the number of years, there were more years with a woman on the throne than there were years with a man. And Jito was maybe the most successful of them, but we could argue about that because there were several others who were quite influential as well. Okay, so there was no ban on women serving on the throne. That stopped in the 8th century, and then there was a gap of about 800 years where women did not serve on the throne. And the reason, at least the reason based on the sources, I'm kind of sad to have to share it, but it had to do with the last of those female emperors who was accused by some of the men at court of having had an inappropriate affair with a male advisor, a Buddhist priest who was one of her advisors. And the implication is that she was sleeping with him and that this showed that you clearly couldn't trust a woman on the throne. And so they didn't have any more female emperors for several centuries. Now, there's no real evidence that in fact she was in a sexual relationship with this guy or that he had undue influence over her. So I think this has more to do with male misogynistic historians writing this way, slandering a woman on the throne, than it does with reality. At least there's no proof to support the view. In the 17th century, we again had a couple examples of women serving on the throne. This had to do with very different reasons. The women were descendants of the shogun, the Tokugawa shoguns. So it had to do with kind of someone who was descended both from the imperial family and from the Tokugawa shoguns. And that happened to be a woman. So she served on the throne. But emperors by that time didn't have a lot of real power. Okay. And then it's not till the 19th century, that same set of reforms that I talked about in the Meiji period, that it's actually enacted into law that only men can serve on the throne. And it's actually based on a Salic law example. So this is one of the things, in my opinion, as someone who thinks no reason a woman can't serve on the throne, this was kind of a bad thing an unfortunate thing the Japanese learned from a Western example. But it remains the law today. This became a very hot topic in the early 2000s because at that time, the emperor, the man who recently retired last year, right? The Heisei emperor had 2 sons who were in line for the throne. He also had a daughter, but he had 2 sons who were in line for the throne. But those 2 sons only had girl children. So in the grandchild generation of the emperor at that time, there were only girls, which meant if they didn't change the law, the imperial line was going to die out, right? Because there was no male heir. And I hate to say this because it's not the kid's fault, but I kind of want to say unfortunately, the second son, his wife gave birth to a baby boy. So now there is a male heir to the throne, and suddenly talk of changing the law, which had been very active in say 2003, 2004, stopped. And it does not appear that there is a change to the law in the imminent future, but I hope there in fact will be, because there's no reason women can't serve on the throne. Certainly no reason based on historical precedent.
So we have I can't read the Japanese name, so forgive me. Considering how modern Japanese nationalists use the imperial connection to Shinto as a talking point, do you think it possible that Shinto could have served the same purpose as Buddhism in the unification / spread of imperial influence, or is that unlikely?
That's a really good question. I do think there's no question that the royal family and then imperial family benefited from its role as, its supposed connection as direct descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. and that its role as kind of the primary or most important Shinto ritualist in the country. So in that sense, yes. But the modern nationalists are really talking about something else. So what I said up to now is really, even in pre-modern and medieval times. But Shinto underwent a transformation in the late 19th century. So remember, we talked already about how there were all these major changes that happened at that time as Japan kind of opened up to more foreign influence and tried to compete for great power status on the world stage. The previous government, the Tokugawa shogunate, had relied heavily on Buddhism. So perhaps as a reaction to that, the new Meiji government chose to raise up Shinto and lower the status of Buddhism. Many Buddhist temples actually were desecrated as a result of this, which is very unfortunate. But Shinto gained a new status. And part of that was because the new Meiji government had the emperor as its head of state, right? And part of what made the emperor special was his connections to Japan's native religion, which was Shinto. And so again, there was talk in the late 19th century about Buddhism as a foreign religion, even though by that point it had been part of Japan for, 1500 years. So it seems hard to think of it that way, but there was such talk. So I think that, and definitely in the Meiji period in the early 20th century, there were Shinto shrines erected in every village that in theory were part of the imperial system, that school children were supposed to pledge their allegiance to the emperor the same way that American kids might pledge allegiance to the flag. And all of this was connected to ideas of Shinto, but that's a more modern phenomenon. I think that questioner is referring to.
My late father has told me memories of during the colonial era,
Yes.
even Korean kids
Yep.
being sent to Shinto temples regularly to worship.
Absolutely.
Okay, great, thank you. So Deborah Cohn has a question. As a result of all this movement of ideas and political strategies, is there an accompanying movement of language and of political terms? Do the language become more similar in this borrowing and adaptation from China?
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. That's a great question. No doubt that the Japanese are learning certain key lingo or terminology or jargon from these texts that are in Chinese translation, even if they're brought over or introduced by Koreans. But keep in mind also that at this time, written Chinese, especially by, the medieval period, written Chinese serves a function like Latin did in medieval Europe, right? It's simply the language of educated people. So it wouldn't necessarily be the case that a well-educated Japanese person would think, oh, now I'm going to use Chinese. It's simply the language you use of civilization, right? But they're reading these texts, many of them in Chinese. Many Japanese records are kept in written Chinese, but that written Chinese is modified to fit Japanese contexts. So the language, we refer to it as the language of Kanbun. If you know how to read classical Chinese, you can do a pretty good job of picking out the main points of a Kanbun text, but there definitely will be some terminology that is unique to the Japanese context. Excuse me for just a second. Therefore, if you really want to be able to read these texts, you want to study Kanbun itself, which I and a few of the other people I see here contributing to this discussion do. But definitely it influences the way these records are kept. It influences the certain terminology that is used, and even the ways of conceiving some of these things like religious ideas or government statecraft. So there definitely is some interaction and mingling going on, yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, and an anonymous attendee asks, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. My question is, how much relevance do you see in today's East Asian governments regarding the importance of centralization? And if you can speak to it, local governments' interest to balance such strong central governments out?
Yeah, wow. That's a hard question to answer. It's interesting to think about. Obviously, are there some patterns set in this period that influence the period that follows it, that influences the period that follows it in turn? Sure. There we go. But I'm really wary as a historian of trying to draw a line from, say, 6th, 7th century all the way into modern times. There's a lot that changes along the way. Certainly, if we think big picture now about Chinese dynasties, there is no question that there is a major shift that happens, with the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol-led dynasty. So we're talking now 13th century roughly. And that even when the Mongols are pushed out of China, so the Yuan dynasty is the first kind of non-ethnically Han Chinese dynasty to rule all of China. And even when the Mongols are pushed back to the north in the 14th century, the subsequent Ming dynasty, which is an ethnically Chinese dynasty, takes on a number of notable aspects of the previous Yuan rule, rather than revert to an earlier Chinese dynasty like the Song, right? In the case of Japan, the period that I've been talking about today, like 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, you'll notice I didn't make any mention of the word samurai anywhere in this, right? Because we don't really see samurai as actors on the national stage, so to speak, until, 12th century or so. And when samurai do finally come to power, they bring about major changes in the way government is carried out. And they have a role in national level government until the 19th century. So I guess the point I'm making is, I'm sure there are some basic patterns that have, domino effect influence down the road, but, there's so much more that happens between, say, the 7th century and the 21st century that I'm really reluctant to try to draw a straight line that way.
Okay, great. Thank you. Right. So Visa Ala Lusua asks, I'm interested in the coins. Why are the characters in the characters read clockwise, while in the other ones, for example, they're read top to bottom, right to left? Isn't the better way? Isn't the latter way the usual way to read them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've noticed that as well, as have many other people. I don't know that I have a good answer for them. So if I can go back to that slide really quick, and I'll put it up on the screen. So give me just 1 second here, please. Here we go. I'll share screen again. Okay. So what the question is asking about is, if you look at these coins here in the middle, the kind of bigger ones, this would be read, Wa is the character right here, Do, Kai, Chin. So it's read clockwise around it. Now, if we compare it, now I don't have a good picture of Kaiwen Dongbao on this, but Kaiwen Dongbao would be read basically top to bottom and then right to left, right? So it'd be, this was a clock face, the Chinese coin would have been read 12, 6, 3, 9. Whereas the Japanese coin is read 12, 3, 6, 9 that way, right? I don't know that I have an answer for that. I do think there are some examples of both, but if we look at the ones down here, the Japanese Man and Suho is read that way. This one, Kengen Taiho is read that way. So it appears to be a Japanese pattern. And I have charts that show me these, Chinese equivalent coins, but I don't have one in this presentation. So I guess, Vesa, if you want to email me later, I'm happy to look into this and maybe we can correspond afterwards. I don't have a good answer for you at the moment, but it is an intriguing question. That being said, it's still the preponderance of evidence that suggests the Wado Kaichin draws on Tang models is just overwhelming in my opinion.
Absolutely. Great, thank you. All right. Okay, so anonymous attendee asks, how are Shotoku's contributions to early Japan perceived today, and has that perception changed over time?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, Shotoku's contributions to Japan, I'm not going to speak much about today because I'm not most up to date on this. There are people who have worked on Shotoku Taishi. In fact, he's one of the few people, if you were to look at various states, I mean, United States states like Michigan or California or Missouri, and look at their state history standards, if they mention any Japanese person by name in those state, world history standards, he's probably the one guy they mention, which is kind of curious. He was very, very famous, particularly in the, I guess, late 19th and 20th centuries. As you saw in my earlier slide, he was featured on the 10,000 yen bill for a while. But those opinions of him have fluctuated over time. I know there's a great chapter in Stephen Vlastos's book, which is called something, it's got Mirror in the title. If Paula Curtis is still listening, she might know what book I'm talking about and type it for us in the chat. She did add, by the way, the Nadia Kanagawa article that I was referring to. I mentioned her book, which I hope is forthcoming. She's the scholar who works on immigrants in early Japan. But there's a book by Stephen Vlastos. Give me 1 second. Mirror of Modernity. Thank you so much, Roberto. Mirror of Modernity by Stephen Vlastos has an article on Prince Shotoku. And I believe Kevin Carr, who's an art historian, has also done some work on Shotoku and changing images of Shotoku over time. So those would be the places to look for more information on Shotoku. Among people like me who are kind of historians of ancient and medieval Japan, one notable shift in the way we think about him, it used to be the case in, say, early 20th century history writings that scholars, almost all of them men, assumed Shotoku was the regent and wielded real power because the emperor at the time, Emperor Suiko, was a woman. Okay, and again, I think, and I'm not alone in this, I mean, Joan Pigott and others have written on this, so it's not my original idea, but think that that's actually a bunch of hooey, and that Emperor Suiko, the woman, was able to wield power and rule in her own right. Shotoku may have assisted, but this kind of older male-biased view that basically because she was a woman, she couldn't really have wielded any power, and it must have been her nephew, the prince, who really had power, is one that most of us don't put much credence in today. So in that sense, his stock has fallen a little bit, though that doesn't mean he still didn't do a lot of great stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thank you. The last question from a person with a Japanese name. You spoke on the Kojiki, etc., as examples of innovation, but could you note any more for us to explore?
Sure. So, I mean, you're only going to appreciate the ways in which Kojiki differs from that Chinese model. And this requires a lot of reading. So would be to actually look at some of these Chinese dynastic histories and then look at the Kojiki. And I think even in translation, I mean, the best way to do it would be in the original, but I think even in English translation, you'll be able to pick up on kind of differences in tone, differences in subject matter. You know, Kojiki incorporates a lot of kind of local native legends. Not that the Chinese histories don't, but the Chinese histories are more document-based. They were more the kind of work that I think a modern historian would appreciate, rather than perhaps some of the things that make it into Kojiki. So that contrast, I think, will be clear if you look at them. If you look at the poetry, again, I recommended this poetry collection, Manyoshu, which is sometimes in English called 10,000 Leaves, and lots of examples of poems in translation. And you compare them to some of the contemporaneous Tang Dynasty poetry. And mind you, Tang Dynasty poets, some of these poets are among the great poets of world literature. So I'm not knocking the Chinese poets at all. I'm simply pointing out that I think you'll see some differences in style that suggest these Japanese poets were not merely copying what they saw in the Chinese examples, right? Now, later on, by the medieval period, you will see some literature scholars who will accuse Japanese poets of kind of being, following a form, a rote form, and they don't have some of the liveliness or expression that we see in some of the earlier Japanese poetry, though Japanese literature scholars will argue on this point, and I'm not going to get in the middle of that. Another example of innovation, if you want to get into the details of government, you'll find very quickly the Japanese start moving away from the Tang example of government. They create new government ministries that the Chinese never had. They create new government posts. They create the Kebeishi, which is an imperial police force. They create a minister of the center position, which doesn't exist in the Chinese model, things like that. And for examples of that, I mean, one source among many would be this book that I mentioned and I quoted earlier, The Emergence of Japanese Kingship by Joan Pigott, which will give you a lot of nitty-gritty details on how these early rulers, took and modified Chinese examples to raise the level of central government authority at this time.
Professor Segal, if you could stop screen sharing.
Oh, my apologies.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yep. So this was the book I was just showing you right here, The Emergence of Japanese Kingship by Joan Pigott, where she talks about a lot of this development and will give you a sense of how Japanese government institutions started to vary from Chinese models. So I hope that gives you a few places to begin anyway.
Absolutely. So that was the last of the questions that we have, but we do have a couple of minutes. So if I may again take advantage of this to ask you a question, I would like to ask a really, really broad historiographical question, because this question of innovation versus imitation is something I see a lot in many different contexts, but so much more in non-Western cultures. Because on the one hand, we could say that, well, all cultures both imitate and innovate, right? And there was a while ago, there was a hilarious thing that I saw about how they asked a lot of Americans, would you be for or against your children being taught Arabic numerals? And a majority of Americans said they were against it, yes, right? Yeah. And so there was a case of, but nobody really asked, when Arabic science came into the Western Europe, were Europeans imitating or they were innovating, right?
And of course, Arabic numerals, which are the numbers we all use, aren't even originally from the Middle East or from India, right? Exactly. So they're already important.
So I was thinking that I think the reason why the question is, question seems not so relevant to the West, but much more relevant to non-Western civilization, is that perhaps even now scholars are trying to grapple with this deep-seated prejudice that comes from the imperial era, that the West is the sole fount of innovation. Yeah. And when other cultures, compete as well, they are not really innovating; they're just imitating. And that that scholars like yourself and many others are still trying to struggle against that prejudice that's still deeply set in.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, when I do, I sometimes am involved in kind of outreach teacher training workshops for world history teachers, and this is one of the big ideas I try to engage them with. That I think there's a widespread notion in the minds of, the ordinary person walking down the street, that from the moment Columbus set sail until the end, the anti-colonialism, in the post-World War II era, that basically the West dominated the planet. And that, of course, is not true. So there is definitely lingering effects of that kind of imperialism, colonialism legacy that colors the thinking of many people. And it's not just that. I mean, you find evidence of it in, say, middle school and high school world history textbooks, which is troubling. Turning to the more specific case here, the interesting thing, of course, is this is not an example that uses the West, right? This is Japan copying an East Asian neighbor. Mm-hmm. And I think it is fair to say that China set the pattern for East Asia for millennia, right? So there is basis for it. But part of where it comes up in the Western historiography dates to the early 20th century, when you had a lot of scholars, a lot of historians were actually former missionaries or the children of missionaries who had spent time in China or Japan, and that colored their views of the relationship between the two, right? And so it was easy for them maybe to fall into this trap of assuming the Japanese were copying China. And then that kind of set the pattern in the early English writings, meaning early 20th century English writings on this topic that people have been reacting to kind of ever since, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We're right out of time. The perfect timing with a question. Thank you so very much for totally fascinating work. And I'm sure I'll be sure to follow your future writings and also the works that you have recommended. Thank you.
I appreciate very much, everyone, your attention. And thanks again to the University of Missouri St. Louis, to Professor Kang for so graciously moderating, and Professor Miller for inviting